Hi, and welcome back to Train Signal. We're continuing our discussion of advanced security features, advanced features overall of the Windows Server operating system family. Claims and resource properties are next on our agenda. Claims and resource properties are important parts of a scheme referred to as Dynamic Access Control, or DAC. DAC is designed to be a supplement to our existing security infrastructure in a way that's going to allow us to enable some really rather interesting functionality. Specifically, Dynamic Access Control is going to give us a way to be able to layer additional ways of thinking about security on top of what we already know how to do with shared folder permissions, with NTFS permissions. Consider for a moment the challenges of, for example, a national organization that has 5 different departments in 10 different offices around the country. And within each of those offices, you've got people who are in a managerial position. Some are executives, some are staff employees, each with different levels of access to resources based upon whether they're a manager or not, depending upon whether in their office or a different office or not, depending upon whether they're accessing resources for their department or a different department. So all those considerations work into permissioning, but historically we've done that through group management. If I want to be able to build a set of resources that are only accessible to people who are part of our Dallas office and are part of our production team but are also managers, I need a Dallas Production Managers group. If I want to grant access to things in the Seattle office to people who are in marketing, as long as they're staff, I need a Seattle Marketing Staff group. Well, if I've got 10 different offices and 5 different departments, well, that's 50 different groups right there, times one each for each of the 3 different security levels at each location. I'm like up to 150 groups to cover all the possible combinations of people who are just Dallas people, or they're just R&D people, and I might have resources that are available to anybody in marketing. But some things are limited to marketing only if you're in New York City, or in production only if you're in Miami. So how do I manage that? How do I rein in the insanity? Dynamic Access Control is designed to help reduce the number of groups you need to manage by providing a new approach to permissions management referred to as claims-based authentication. Most of our authentication that we do in Active Directory is driven by what are referred to as security principles. You get to do things because you have a particular security ID attached to your user account. Or you get to do certain things because you have a certain security ID attached to groups of which you're a member. And either of those things are sufficient to be able to get you where you want to go, at least they have historically. You log in to Windows, and Windows generates an access token for you, and that token has this set of security IDs, and off you go. Claims-based authentication takes a different approach. Claims-based authentication says that when you authenticate against that authority, when you go talk to that organizational resource, in Windows it's a domain controller, that is able to identify who you are, that in addition to giving you descriptions of security groups of which you're a member, it also identifies other pieces of data about you referred to as claims. Claims are statements made by some authority about you as a user, or perhaps, if you're running Windows 8 or later, your computer as a device. The intent is to be able to allow us to supply additional helpful information, data about what a user or a computer device is like. We're essentially taking the attributes available to Active Directory and exposing them as pieces of information that an application can consume and look at and decide whether or not to give you access to something based upon the fact that Active Directory says there's this interesting piece of data about you. In doing so, it unlocks some really rather interesting, exciting behavior that we'll actually be able to demonstrate for you here. 2 kinds of claims are supported by the Windows Server 2012 environment. What are called user claims. As you might well imagine, those are claims about user accounts, your office, your department, your job title, your manager. These are pieces of information about you stored in Active Directory. The other side of the coin is device claims. Information about computers, information about the operating system that it's running, information about where in the world it's physically located, things of that sort. What service pack version are we on? Those pieces of information are pieces of data that Active Directory stores, or can store, about computer accounts. Now, all of this assumes that we've got the organizational workflow in process to be able to make sure that all the data in Active Directory is updated correctly. If it's not, then this whole system's going to fall apart on us. But for those that have the operational savvy to be able to manage this wisely and well, we can turn on some really rather interesting functionality. These claim types are going to come to us by way of a tool called the Active Directory Administrative Center. Now, this is a tool that we haven't talked much about as of yet, but we're going to explore it here. The ADAC is a update to, an improvement upon in some ways, the Active Directory Users and Computers tool that we've used in the past. Now, we still have access to that. Let me jump over to Server 1 and we'll take you on a walk through it. The Active Directory Administrative Center is accessible from Server Manager, as everything is, or almost everything. Here's our good friend Active Directory Users and Computers, which still works, by the way. There's nothing wrong with it. It uses the MMC, Microsoft Management Console style of interface. Microsoft began introducing this new approach, this Active Directory Administrative Center, with Server 2008R2, designed to do a couple of things. One was to be able to take some of the commonly administered tasks done by system administrators and put them together in a spot that would be easy to get at. If you're a help desker, what's the first thing you're going to do most often? Well, you're going to reset people's passwords. They're going to call and say, help, I need my password reset. Okay, there you go. Or I might go search for some user or some OU that I need to maintain. So there's one reason for doing this tool. The other reason is to be able to enable PowerShell-driven support for administration coming from a GUI. Now, we've touched on PowerShell in passing here and there, and we'll hit it in more detail later. But it's interesting to note that just about everything that you do from the Active Directory Administrative Center, and kind of in the same way that we do with just about everything that we do from the Server Manager utility, drives PowerShell changes in the background. So what we're going to do is we're going to explore a little bit of that functionality as we work our way further along. But for the time being, let's do something simple. Let's validate that there exist these things called claim types. And that lives here in an area of the Active Directory Administrative Center called Dynamic Access Control. 5 major kinds of objects hang together in the Dynamic Access Control universe. And as a logical starting point, let's take a look at claim types. Claim types are pieces of information that describe some entity that I want to know something about that's in Active Directory. So you'll note that there are no claim types by default. There are no specific plans that Active Directory has in mind when you first set up Dynamic Access Control. It's up to you to decide what pieces of information, if any, you want to use for claims, by which we mean what pieces of information, what attributes of user accounts do I want to be able to use as a potential permissioning tool, as a way to be able to identify whether or not someone gets access to some resource. So by way of demonstration, I've got a particular set of files over on my Server 2. Let me jump over there for just a moment. So here's Server 2. And in my C drive, I've got a hierarchy of folders dedicated to discussing the security policies at Building 6. This is presumably one of Building 6's file servers, or it's near Building 6. Those are employees that are working in Building number 6 are going to want to be able to have access to that info. I might even want to restrict who has access to that information just to those people who work in Building 6. Because if you're not in Building 6, you don't need that information, for one, and I might want to create a deliberate partitioning of information to make sure that people who don't need to know how to get into Building 6 don't get to know. So, how do I do that? I want to be able to turn on a office location-based set of permissioning. Now, if I was to do that in a traditional permissioning strategy, I would probably do something like build a whole set of groups. And that means that anytime I wanted to be able to change an employee's building location, they change jobs and change buildings that their office is in, I would now need to deassign them from all the groups of which they're a member because they're a Building 6 user, and add them to the groups that give them access to what they need because they're now in Building 12. So, what I'd rather do is just be able to permission what somebody's able to do or not just based upon the property in their user account. So I'm going to need a claim. I need to tell Active Directory to prepare to provide the office location information to somebody who wants to know, like a file server. I'm going to jump back to Server 1. And back here on Server 1, I need to create a claim type. I'm going to create a new claim right there. That claim is going to draw its source from one of the list of attributes that describes Active Directory users or computers. Remember, I can make user claims or device claims. And in this case, I want the one that describes Office. Let me go show you for a moment the property of the user account that I want to be able to work with, and we'll see as we do so how to get to the particular source attribute that we care about here on this side of our GUI. I can stay right here in the Active Directory Administrative Center because it is also effectively an Active Directory users and computers like tool. Let's go find information for one of our users. Let's go to our staff OU, and I've got a user named Erica here. You can see that Erica is a user in Building 2. She's in the marketing department, so she is definitely in Building 2. So she's somebody who we would expect not to be able to have access to the Building 6 security information. Meanwhile, in the Managers OU, we've got a user called Nelson. Does Nelson work in Building 6? Nope, he's Building 2. How about his neighbor Nina? Nina work in Building 6. She does. Nina's a Building 6 user. She's in HR. So she's in the Human Resources Department. She works in Building 6. Building 6 here appears next to a label that says Office. And common sense would say there should be an Office property. But here's the interesting surprise. If we go back to our claim type creation tool, and I try to create a claim type tied to the Office attribute, and I scroll through the list of Active Directory properties looking for Office, I get to the point where Office should be, and to my horror, it's not there. There's object version, there's operating system, Office should lie between the two, it just ain't there. Where is it? Well, it's one of these properties, but how would we possibly know which one? There's hundreds of them. Well, here's a handy trick. PowerShell can ride to your rescue. Let me jump into my PowerShell window here for just a moment, and I'm going to do a get-ad user, and I want to identify the particular user whose information I want to retrieve. That identity is the user who I was just looking at. Who we're looking at? Max? I think we're looking at Max. So there's information about Max. By default, PowerShell will show me 10 particularly relevant properties about that user account, but certainly there's lots more information worth gathering. I can add additional properties that I want to be able to retrieve information about. I can go get his, for example, member of property to identify what groups he's a member of. I can identify what department he's in. But if I say Office, I run into a snag. Oh, it's smart enough. PowerShell actually does the work for me. Look at that. Office property there does say Building 2. That's neat. PowerShell is doing something clever. I didn't anticipate how wise and clever PowerShell in fact is. Interestingly, we saw that Office is really not technically the name of the property. PowerShell is nice enough to be able to show me that information. This is an alias property, as it turns out. But what I want to see is the actual property name that I can reference from inside of my Active Directory Administrative Center, because I don't see that there. So let me do this. Let me get all available properties. Dash properties star. And let's look for that Building 2 information. Look at that. Building 2 is tied to a property called Physical Delivery Office Name. Okay. This is the name in what's called the Active Directory schema that relates to the object that we're looking for. We can see the friendly descriptive up here for Office, but this is the one that's going to appear in the Active Directory Administrative Center. It's reading directly from the Active Directory schema, the blueprints for all objects in Active Directory. So there's the property name that I care about, Physical Delivery Office Name. Let me come on back to my Claim Type tool. We go scroll down into the P's, and there is Physical Delivery Office Name. So that's what I want to base my claim upon. You'll note that it has a particular type. It's a string. It's a piece of text. It can apply to either user or computer type claims. It has a description that we can see appears over here off to the right. To be able to make this available, I want to be able to put this in the GUI to be able to do permissions management. Calling it Physical Delivery Office Name is kind of cumbersome. I'd rather use the name that actually appears in the Active Directory Users and Computers GUI that people are used to. So let's call it Office. Which type of claims do I want this to be tied to? I'm going to use this as a user claim, I could theoretically envision a situation where I want to limit the behavior of a computer to only those computers that have a particular Office property, and it turns out this claim type is supported with the computer class, so let me turn that on too, just in case sometime later I need it. I can leave either one off if I don't intend to ever use it the other way. I can always turn that on later if I needed to as well. I now have a claim type for Office. I have identified to Active Directory that at some point I want to be able to manage permissions in a way that takes advantage of that Office property. But before we go use this Office property, what we need to do is make a small change to the behavior of the KDC, the Kerberos Key Distribution Center. Kerberos is the brains of user authentication in Active Directory. It secures the communication between domain controller and client, domain controller and server. It manages a series of tickets designed to communicate between those various components to secure that environment. By default, Kerberos doesn't do claims-based authentication. Might surprise you, being it's a neat new feature of Server 2012, but by default knows nothing about it, has nothing to do with it until you tell it to do so. So that's what we're going to do next. So let's jump over to the Group Policy Management console and we'll turn on this important feature. Inside of my forest, I'm going to go configure my domain controllers OU. I want to change the behavior of my DCs because at the moment they're the place where the Kerberos Key Distribution Center runs. Obviously they're the Kerberos hosts. They implement the Kerberos realm. So I'm going to build a GPO whose name is going to be Dynamic Access Control Policy. And that policy is going to carry a setting to enable our work with dynamic access control. Place to find it is here, Computer Configuration Policies System KDC, Kerberos Key Distribution Center. And you'll note, I like to click standard here. I'm an old school guy. I like the large left-right view here. KDC support for claims, compound authentication, and Kerberos armoring. Claims is claims-based authentication of the type that we're talking about. Compound authentication is a fancy term that describes the building of access tokens that are part traditional access token and part claims information. So that's a feature I need to turn on. And Kerberos armoring. When we turn on this special Kerberos support, we're armoring all of our Kerberos messages. We're encrypting everything Kerberos does. It used to be that Kerberos would encrypt much of what it does, but I can actually do a greater quantity of it here for that purpose. So we are going to enable this feature. By default, of course, it's not configured, which is effectively equivalent to disabled for our purposes. It's not on by default. So I want to enable it. When I enable it, I can enable it in a not supported mode, which is again kind of like having it not turned on. Supported is the easiest configuration I can turn on. In the supported scenario, domain controllers will attempt to use it if they can, and will be perfectly happy if they can't. This is good in a mixed Server 2012, Server 28R2 domain environment, where I have some domain controllers running 28R2, and at least one, maybe more, running 2012. In that environment, I can use claims-based authentication. I can't do device claims. That's going to require a full Server 2012 environment. But we can do still quite a number of the things that the claims-based authentication environment does with only a mere one Server 2012 domain controller. Preferably one per site. If I've got one per high-speed, high-reliability network, that's preferable. Technically, we could get away with one if we were willing to tolerate the slowdown in bandwidth. Obviously, you want to authenticate against a nearby DC. The other options are in cases where I want to go to an environment that uses all Server 2012 domain controllers. I can turn on an option that will always provide claims, and indeed go so far as to fail an attempt to authenticate that doesn't ask for armored authentication, the kind that carries claims-based authentication. In this case, for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to go with supported. Having made that change, I'm going to go ahead and close up my Group Policy Management Editor. With that done, we've now turned on support for claims-based authentication. We've configured a claim that describes the Office property, that describes the location of a user who's trying to access some document. With that, we should be able to validate whether we're able to actually get into a document that insists upon a user being a member of a particular building in order to get in the door. So let's jump over to File Server 2 and see if that'll work. So here I am on Server 2, and I want to be able to secure, let's say, this whole Building 6 policies folder, because this is a complete set of functionality tied to what Building 6 can do. I'm going to make it available on the network. I want people who are Building 6 users to be able to get in. So let me pull up on the properties. I'm going to share this folder. I'm going to take the lazy way out, one of my privileges as the instructor, and I'm going to throw the shared folder permissions wide open. Everybody gets full control. Let me be a little bit more disciplined. Let me make it authenticated users have full control. You might be aware that authenticated users is a notch more secure than everyone because it does not contain the guest account. Authenticated users otherwise includes the complete list of all user accounts and, interestingly, all computer accounts that are in the domain. So we've shared that folder. I'm going to go to security. I want to be able to configure some permissions for this object. And we've got the fairly traditional looking NTFS permission dialog box here. Interestingly, Microsoft has embedded new claims-specific functionality in the advanced portion of the security dialog box. Specifically, at the moment we can see that I've got users who are able to read and execute on this, but they don't have the ability to make changes. Administrators have full control, of course. What I want to do is I want to give users who are employees in Building 6 and only Building 6 employees the ability to get into these resources. So what I'm going to do, I would like to be able to just delete those users' permissions, but those permissions are being inherited from the C drive. If I try to remove, it's going to say, no, that's an inherited permission. No such luck. So I'm going to turn off permissions inheritance here, taking all the existing inherited permissions and making them explicit permissions instead. That will allow me to throw away the users entries. And I'm going to add a new entry to allow a specific security principal. That's a user or a group or sometimes a computer. I'm going to say authenticated users, anybody who got logged in, can come on into the shared folder if, and I'll let them come in with read access. That's fine, that'll do. If a particular condition is met. And the specific condition that I want to match is I want to know that the user's office property is exactly equal to a value called Building 6. I could potentially add multiple conditions if I chose to. And interestingly, the default connection between those two things is an AND relationship. Isn't that interesting? Ponder for a moment the default NTFS permissions list. I've got a list of entries in the list. If you're a member of the groups, or indeed the individual user account, in any one of those entries, and that entry gives you the permission that you want, you get to do that. Unless, of course, there's a deny, in which case the deny overrides the allow. We know about that. It's essentially a series of OR relationships. If I want to say that I want somebody to access a shared folder if they are a Seattle research and development manager, I can't simply add the Seattle group, the research and development group, the manager group to the access control list, because if I do, I'll get an OR relationship, and I'll let in everybody in Seattle and everybody in R&D and everybody who's a manager. But what if I want not an OR relationship between those, but an AND relationship? I can now do that here. I can set conditional access to the shared folder based upon group memberships. I can ask if the user group is a member of some list of group IDs, group names, then I'll let them in. So I can move from OR to AND here, which is neat. In this case, I only need the one condition, so I'll back out. I can build an OR there, you might have noticed if I chose to. All right, I now have an authenticated users entry that will allow for read access only to users whose office property says Building 6. All right, let's try it out. I'm going to OK these changes. And I'm going to jump over to my client computer and look at it from the perspective of a Windows 8 system. So here I am about to log into my Windows 8 client. I'm going to log on as the user Max. Max, you recall, is a user who's based out of Building 2. Max wants to have access to some resources, and he goes blundering into a particular server. He goes to /New York City server 2 /. There's the Building 6 policies shared folder. He tries to connect. He's told that he doesn't have access. He says, hey, how come I can't get in? He's probably going to call the help desk or something unless we've got some better solution. We do. Let me log out as Max. So I'm going to go ahead and log in as Nina, because there's a handy command on the client OS that was introduced a couple of releases ago, but it got a facelift with Server 28R2. The whoami command. Whoami, all by itself, will tell you what user account you are. In this case, I'm logged on as Nina, a member of the GlobalMantix domain. The new feature that we now get in Windows 8 that wasn't there even in Windows 7, whoami/claims. Aha! We can see that Kerberos support for dynamic access control is not enabled yet on the client. We told the domain controllers to begin offering claims, but we haven't told the client machine to request them. And by default, the client computer is not going to attempt to play the claims game unless it's specifically told to do so. So that's a problem we can fix. We're going to jump over to Server 1. And here on Server 1, we're going to go make a change to Group Policy to turn on that setting. Group Policy Management Console, accessible from Server Manager. And I'm going to add a GPO to my client's OU. My client computer, Win8-Client, is in the client's organizational unit, so I'm going to apply a GPO specifically to target those clients. Real world, of course, you'd attach it to whichever container contains the set of computers who you want to be able to reach out and do claims-based authentication of this sort. So I'm going to create a GPO for this purpose. This is my client dynamic access control policy. And within it, we're going to configure the client component of what we configured on the server side a few minutes ago. I'm going to go to Computer Configuration, Policies, Administrative Templates, System. Last time I was here in Kerberos, the Key Distribution Center, turning on KDC support for claims. I'm going to go one step down this time to Kerberos. And here we see a setting called Enable Kerberos Client Support for claims, compound authentication, and Kerberos arming. So I'm going to enable that setting. We've adequately armored Kerberos. Is that setting enabled? It is. I'm kind of old school in this GUI. I like using the standard tab to be able to see the state and the text all in one shot. Your mileage may vary. But that being said, we've configured the change. We now need to tell the Win8 client computer that we've made that change. That's going to be a GP update at Windows 8 clients. Let me jump over there. There we go. Let's do a GP update /force. There we go, and that'll retrieve the set of configuration settings that we just got done deploying. Having done that, if we do a whoami/claims, we should see something slightly different. Yep, user claims unknown. It no longer says this client computer won't request claims. It's no longer saying that it can't. It's simply saying that it doesn't know what they are currently. The claims processing occurs at login time. So let me force a login for this user. I'm going to use a very handy command line tool here on Nina's computer and log her off. And I'll go ahead and log her back in. I'm going to go back to my command prompt. I'm going to run whoami/claims. And as of the moment, it still says claims are unknown. I've seen an unusual behavior, and I'm still trying to ascertain whether this is something that is native to the product or if it's a design behavior or a bug. I've seen it occasionally take 2 logins for the claims information to populate. I'm not quite sure why, but that being said, let me log off one more time. And then I'll log in one more time. Back to the command prompt one more time. Whoami/claims. Ta-da! Nina has a claim called Office which contains the string Building 6. Nina is in Building 6, and therefore, when she goes to Windows Explorer and attempts to connect to /NYC-SVR2 / Building 6 security policies, she gets in. She's curious to know what the keycard access hours are, and it looks like between 6 p.m. and 8 a.m. the only way in is with the keycard. Cool. Note that I configured no security groups to make that happen. That feature now works for anybody whose user account properties in Active Directory say that they work in Building 6. No group management to be able to turn on that interesting feature. Isn't that cool? The next important feature of dynamic access control that we want to discuss is something called resource properties. Resource properties are kind of the logical flip side of user claims. User claims, or indeed device claims, are information about the user or the device that's attempting to gather information. Resource properties are tags that I can set on the resource I'm connecting to. I'm trying to connect to a file on a file server. I can tag that file with a property that indicates that it has some interesting characteristic to it. And I can similarly drive permissions management around the question of whether or not a user who's trying to connect has a corresponding user claim, and I can use resource properties as the server counterpart to my user claims. And I can say that I will only let somebody into some file resource if that file has a resource property that matches the value of one of my user claims. Maybe I want to make sure that only HR department employees are able to modify certain pieces of information in my file server. Is that something we can do? Sure it is. Let's take a look. Resource properties again come out of the ADAC utilities. Let me jump there. So back on server 1, I want to get back to the Active Directory Administrative Center. I tend, out of superstition, to close the Active Directory Administrative Center when I'm not using it. I've occasionally seen strange behavior where I make a configuration change, I go look at the server that it's supposed to take effect on, it doesn't seem to be there, I beat my head against the wall, I close the Administrative Center utility, and then suddenly it works on the other side. I have no idea if that's a real thing or that's just Mike being superstitious, but if that helps you, hey, great. Let's take a look at resource properties. Resource properties live here, again, under the Dynamic Access Control umbrella. I've been there recently, so the ADAC tool has handily given me a link here, but if it wasn't there, I would of course double-click Resource Properties here. Resource properties are descriptors of a file or some other resource that I want to connect to. We'll use file services just because it's a logical example. We need to choose which particular resource properties are interesting ones that we intend to have access to, that we want to be able to guide permissions management on files and folders thanks to the presence thereof. In this case, I'm going to choose a nice, simple, obvious one. How about department? I might want to restrict access to certain resources to only those people who have particular department information in their configuration. If I go look inside of this department resource property, I can see that it has been pre-configured by Microsoft to describe a list of suggested values. This is a string type property. It can contain some piece of information. So they got a list of plausible organizational departments there, sales and support and marketing and manufacturing and so on. Let's take human resources by way of an example. We've got a human resources employee in our organization. I want to say Nina is HR, if memory serves. Let's go double check. Yep, Nina is in the Human Resources Department. So let's give her, and indeed anybody who's in the Human Resources Department, access to the files that are appropriate for that department. So step one to make that happen is I need to enable that property. Department, you'll note, is currently disabled. You'll see a little down arrow instead of a circle for each of these because they are by default not enabled. Don't assume that the referenced property means disabled. That's an easy guess. There's no specific column that appears by default in the GUI that shows you that it is enabled. It appears down here in the lower right. I can right-click this particular property and enable it, and suddenly my system is now prepared to use this as a feature that will enable secured access to resources that belong to a specific department. Let me go over to File Server 2, where we've got those HR-produced security policies, and let's verify that we can turn on that capability here. So here I am on Server 2. I've activated the resource property department over on server 1. I want to be able to see it from the perspective of server 2. The logical place to do that would be to go visit my file share, pull up its properties, go look at its classification tab, and I'm shocked to see, shocked, I tell you, to see that there's no properties there. Now, why is that? When you make the change in Active Directory Administrative Console, that information gets written to Active Directory in a location referred to as the configuration partition. That might be a bit surprising to those of you that are Active Directory nerds. It doesn't write it into the default naming context, doesn't write it into the domain partition. It writes it into the configuration partition, the benefit being that it's now visible to the entire, not only the domain, but indeed the entire forest. So, the interesting question is, at what point does this server reach out to Active Directory, query that information, and yank it back in? Well, that's not immediately obvious. I haven't seen any documentation that says exactly when it happens, so we could just sit here and wait, periodically closing this window and reopening it, looking to see if it has in fact populated. Nope, not yet. Or, we can do this. We can go to the PowerShell, the ultimate tool. We can go find the module of content that covers File Server Resource Manager functionality. Easiest way to find it, if you don't know where it is, there is a get-module command. Module is a tool to show you what components of Active Directory have been enabled. We can see that PowerShell itself is enabled, but not much else. I can go get a list of other available modules. And in as much as this is a server on which I've installed File Server Resource Manager, it shouldn't surprise us too much to see a File Server Resource Manager module right there. So let me go ahead and import it. So I'm going to type import-module, File Server Resource Manager. I'm going to cheat and use my tab completion feature there, which is terribly handy. Having done that, I've got access to a whole host of helpful commandlets related to FSRM. I'm going to do a get-command focusing on the module called File Server Resource Manager. And I have a very useful command here called update FSRM classification property definition. In other words, reach out to Active Directory, retrieve the list of resource properties that I can use to classify properties, which is effectively what we're doing here. So let me go ahead and trigger that. Update -FSRMC tab. Love tab completion. Tab completion is your friend. I didn't really want to type all those characters. Having done that, we've told this computer, go to the server, retrieve the list of components, yank them back down. And now, just bopping back and forth between tabs is not enough to be able to trigger the retrieval of new properties. I need to close the dialog box and reopen it. And now I can see that this particular file has a department property associated with it. Which department? Let's say that it's part of Human Resources. There we go. I've now configured this file, indeed this whole folder of files, to carry a property that says it's part of HR. If I open this up and browse into the Security Officer Contact Info document, I can see that it is also classified as Human Resources. It says so here. This line is highlighted. That is an HR document in an HR-controlled folder. So, interesting question now is, so now what? Well, what I might want to do is I might want to make sure that this hierarchy of folders is only accessed by somebody whose department property on their user account matches the department property for this file. Or, more formally, where the user claim for the user's department matches the resource property for the file's department. If those things match, then that user belongs accessing this file. How do we do it? I'm going to go back to the Security tab. So I'm going to go to my Advanced Security Properties. I've already got a permission here to give authenticated users read and execute permissions. That inherited down from the top level folder. Let me go back up to the folder and make that change there. So we can see that we've got a access control entry here that will only let ordinary users in if they're building 6 people. I want to change that. So let me edit that. What I'd like to do is to say If the user's department property matches the file's department property, then let them in. So we do have a user item here. I have an office property. I have a group property. That's there by default. I don't need to specify that, but I don't see the department property. Why not? I didn't define a user claim for that. So let me go back over and build a user claim for this purpose. I'm going to jump back over to server 1. Back over here on server 1, I'm going to go to the claim types list. I can see I have a claim type for office. I don't have one for department. So let me add a new claim type. You might be wondering to yourself, why don't we just enable all the claims? Take every attribute and make a claim out of it. You probably heard the idea of token bloat, of having access tokens with too many group memberships in it and slowing it down and making it too large and slowing down logins. Same thing happens with claims. If I have too many claims, needless claims, in my access tokens get large. It takes more time to be able to transfer them across the wire. My logins get slower. My domain controllers do more work. So the goal is to turn on just as many claims as are needed, but not more. Let me go turn on the one for department. There's my department claim type. It's offering me to create a display name department in lowercase. I'd rather make that capital letters. I might even make it a more friendly description if I chose to, company department. Internally, the system will think of it as the internal name, but we will know it as company department when we look at it in our GUI. Alright, I've okayed that change. Let's go take a look at that from server 2's side. Back here on server 2, let me check to see if that property dropped in. It hasn't yet. Let me close and reopen my dialog box. Nope, not yet. Let me close the whole GUI, and I'll go marching back in again. Okay, that's still good. Let's go take a look at security. There we go. And I want to set up a scenario where the user's company department equals a resource property called department. If the user's department is the same thing as the resources department, then I'll allow this read access. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and let the authenticated user in question have modify access, because that person is presumably an HR employee. I want to let them make changes as need be. Having done that, let me commit those changes. And let's see if an HR employee is able to get in, and if somebody who's not HR is prevented. So I'm going to go ahead and jump over to my client computer. So here on my Windows 8 client, Nina is still logged in. You'll recall she's the HR person who works in Building 6. She recently got access to those files on the basis of being a Building 6 employee. That information being derived from claims in her Active Directory account. Let me log off as her and log in as somebody who we know is definitely not part of HR. And we're going to go ahead and log in as Erica. Erica's in the marketing department, which is very different from human resources. So Erica wants to access those shared folders on server 2. /nyc-svr2 / building 6 security policies. She's told, nope, no can do. So let's try logging in as Nina again. We should be able to verify that when Nina tries to connect in, that because she's HR, she strolls right on in. Yep, sure enough. And she wants to be able to make a modification. The keycard access time frame is now going to shift. We're now going to open the doors each morning at 8:30. Can she make that change? Yes, she can. So as you can see, experimenting with claim types and with resource properties enables a number of interesting security scenarios. I can describe somebody's access to or inability to access a file without recourse to even discussing groups. In the past, something that would have required potentially 2, 3 different groups to be able to describe properly is now a fairly elementary process of setting up some basic descriptions of what key information is important on files on user accounts and hooking the two together. If I can do that, I can accomplish a great number of security benefits with a fairly elementary amount of work. Thanks for listening to the discussion of claim types and resource properties. I look forward to sharing more information with you in the next lesson.